What if I told you there's a gospel that never made it to the canon that could have changed everything we know about Jesus? A text so controversial, so explosive, it was wiped from history. What if there were a Christianity in which the crucifixion, resurrection, and the Christian essence of Christ as a divine being were described in a manner utterly unlike that of the 4 books in the Bible, known as the Gospels? What if this missing gospel could change the whole basis for faith? The authenticity and authority of the texts that make the Bible has been hotly debated for centuries among theologians and religious scholars. Some were included, others tossed aside, buried, destroyed. Among those lost texts is the Gospel of Peter, a work whose survival might have changed Christian history significantly. But why was it erased? Who made the decision for this gospel to fade from memory? And perhaps most importantly, what did it say that was so dangerous? The Gospel of Peter is no ordinary apocryphal text. It is unique because it depicts a version of the final moments of Jesus that is strikingly different from what we read in the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The particulars in this lost gospel provoke questions to the core about the crucifixion of Jesus, the involvement of Pontius Pilate, and even the essence of Christ himself. But here is where things get even stranger. The Gospel of Peter was not completely lost. A fragment of this ancient text was discovered in Egypt by archaeologists in the late 19th century. It was discovered inside the tomb of a Christian monk, buried and forgotten, as if someone had long ago tried to preserve it for future generations. When scholars took a look at it, they were shocked. The words inscribed on the fragile parchment told a story that was both the same and different, an account of the death and resurrection of Jesus that veered from accepted versions. Could this mean the story of events we've heard for centuries was doctored? Erased from history. But why? If this gospel was an original gospel, however, a question remains, and that is, why was this gospel suppressed if it was known? Who had the authority to determine which books were included in the Bible and which were excluded? The early centuries of Christianity were not characterized by a single unified version of the faith. He had his place in the sect he led, and in the sacred texts of the time. The Gospel of Peter was accepted as canon by some early Christians, while it was rejected as heresy by others. As the church became more powerful, it began to seek a unified, canonical, patriarchal Christianity. It was not until the 4th century that councils met to determine what would be considered the New Testament. Works that ran counter to the church's burgeoning orthodoxy were deemed dangerous, misleading, and in some cases blasphemous. Is it possible that the Gospel of Peter told a version of events that challenged the religious elites and therefore was censored? And if so, what precisely did it say that was so dangerous? The answers are there in the remaining scraps of this lost gospel of Jesus, which depicts his final hours and resurrection in an unprecedented way. But before we reveal its secrets, we need to have an understanding of the world in which this gospel was written. Because only by visiting the past can we understand why it was redacted and what it has to teach. It was the winter of 1886 to 87, deep in the Egyptian desert, when archaeologists made a discovery that would shake the foundations of biblical history. In the ancient graveyard of Akhmim, tucked into the tomb of a Christian monk, they found a fragile manuscript, its pages yellowed with age, its text inscribed in Greek. It seemed at first like just another early Christian text. But as scholars studied the words and decoded it, they quickly understood that they were in possession of something special. It was no ordinary document. It was a lost gospel, a text previously referred to in secular historical accounts, but lost for centuries, the Gospel of Peter. As soon as scholars started to translate the text, one thing was clear. This gospel told a version of Jesus' final days so different from anything in the Bible. It recounted the crucifixion, the resurrection, and even supernatural phenomena during the return of Jesus in ways that made the accounts in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John seem, at best, incomplete. And that's when the actual controversy started. What accounted for the long absence of this gospel? Why was it not included in the Bible? But why the church denounced it so quickly once it came up again? To figure that out, we need to check what exactly was written inside this ancient text. First of all, notice some significant differences between the Gospel of Peter and the traditional story in which Jesus is crucified and resurrected. It portrays Pontius Pilate in a far more innocent light, shifting blame for Jesus' death nearly all on the Jewish authorities. It depicts Jesus as prayerfully silent throughout his execution, never displaying any hints of human suffering, an image far in contrast to the agony portrayed in the New Testament Gospels. But maybe the most shocking detail of all, the resurrection scene. But Jesus does not just rise from the tomb in this version. What happens instead, according to the Gospel of Peter, is a dramatic, supernatural event. Two giant angels descend from heaven, enter the tomb, and come out carrying a giant Jesus, whose head reaches into the sky. A talking cross walks behind them, speaking as if it were alive. This otherworldly, almost mythological version of the resurrection was not mirrored in the accepted biblical record, and for the church, it was more than it could take. Any news of the rediscovery of the Gospel of Peter was met with instant rejection, not wedding bells, from the church. Church authorities labeled the text as heretical, unreliable, and dangerous. They claimed it was written too late, that it had been corrupted by non-Christian influences, and that it offered a false account of Jesus' last moments. But was that truly the reason? Or was there something more disturbing about this gospel that posed a risk to the church's grip on Christian doctrine? Because if the Gospel of Peter's account of the crucifixion and resurrection took off, it would have rewritten the very foundation of Christianity. The four accepted Gospels formed the basis of Christian teaching, a product of centuries of work by the church. An alternative version of mystical imagery, supernatural elements, different thinking about Jesus' death could have pulled everything in another direction. And thus, the Gospel of Peter was tossed aside yet again. The Gospel of Peter never really took hold, however, although it did resurface. The manuscript discovered in Egypt was only a serrated fragment. Historians suspect most of the original composition remains in the dark. But its rediscovery unlocked a door that could never be shut completely. Because now the world could know that a different version of Jesus' story once existed. And what if one lost gospel had been lost to history? How many others had he buried too? Imagine that everything you believed you knew about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection was missing an element, or perhaps was even consciously distorted. That's the disconcerting possibility the Gospel of Peter raises. When scholars published their first translations of the text, they weren't simply perusing another early Christian document. They were revealing a version of Jesus' last hours that looked nothing like the ones described in the Bible. And that's what made it perilous. The New Testament Gospels describes Jesus as suffering agonizingly at his own crucifixion. He moans in agony. He sounds human torment. And at his last breath says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But in the Gospel of Peter, things go down very differently. Jesus seems detached from human suffering, remaining silent throughout his crucifixion, unaware that he is being tortured. Instead of the suffering Messiah of the New Testament, this Jesus is detached, almost godlike, as if his body is present, but he is above physical agony. The gospel also shifts the blame for the execution of Jesus. It puts the onus not on the Roman authorities, but on Jewish leaders, an important turn away from the more equal treatment given to all in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Pontius Pilate, who in the biblical Gospels condemns Jesus under political pressure, seems nearly innocent in this text. This was a radical departure, one that could have significantly shaped how the world perceived Jesus' final hours. But the real shock was in the Gospel's account of the resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is described in simple but powerful terms in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. Women come to the tomb and see the stone rolled away, the angel who tells them that Jesus has risen. Later on, Jesus appears to his followers and shows them that he is alive. But the Gospel of Peter offers an entirely different tale, one which is much more mystical, surreal, and altogether supernatural. This text states that 2 enormous celestial personalities come down from the sky above, with their heads touching the clouds. They go into Jesus' tomb and pull him out, not in the way you might pull out an average-sized person, but as a colossal figure, whose head goes all the way up to the sky. What follows behind them is something extremely bizarre, a talking cross, which sounds with the voice of God. The imagery is unlike anything in the canonical Gospels, whereas in the Gospel of Peter, instead of a simple, human-like resurrection, there seems to be some sort of cosmic, otherworldly event. And that became a sore problem for the early church. By finally presenting the true Jesus, the Gospel of Peter cast serious doubt on the meticulously created portrait of Christ the church had been crafting for over a millennium. It had a way of blurring the line between divine and human. This Gospel's Jesus is so unconcerned with suffering that he becomes less human than the Gospel's description of Jesus in the Bible, which is at odds with the idea that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, a belief that was central to the mainstream Christian teaching. It also introduced mystical elements that didn't quite fit with traditional teachings. A talking cross? A giant supernatural Jesus? These details might have been taken for mystical visions about historical events. The church had tugged for centuries to anchor Jesus' narrative as a real historical moment, not a mythical tale. The Gospel of Peter also alters the story of Jesus' death and who was responsible for it. It tells a story in which Jewish authorities are fully culpable and Rome's role is minimized. It was dangerous to do this because it could serve to stoke anti-Jewish sentiment, as the earliest church wanted to do everything in their power to avoid. What then can we say about the Gospel of Peter relative to the 4 biblical Gospels? In the Bible, Jesus suffers and cries out in agony. In the Gospel of Peter, he is quiet and removed from pain. In the Bible, he orders the execution but is reluctant. In the Gospel of Peter, he can be seen as nearly free of guilt, with the Jews taking the heat. And in the Bible, the resurrection is an ordinary occurrence, with women discovering an empty tomb. In the Gospel of Peter, it is an impressive supernatural spectacle with enormous angels and a speaking cross. These divergences endangered the stability of Christian doctrine. Had this scene of events made the cut into the Bible, Christianity may have appeared vastly different today. Many scholars contend that the Gospel of Peter was a later Greek composition than the 4 biblical Gospels, possibly even from the 2nd century AD, decades after Jesus' life. Some challenges they make include that it was never adopted as official scripture by any early church father. Supernatural elements seem exaggerated and are too miraculous compared to the more natural ones in the New Testament, and fragments of the gospel were found only in a single place, suggesting it was not widely circulated. But others say that just because it was rejected doesn't mean it wasn't an authentic tradition. Could it be that early Christians indeed believed this version of Jesus' story, but that eventually it was erased from history? In fact, the Gospel of Peter was more than just an alternative version. It was a menace to the beautifully arranged view of Christianity that the church had set up. And so it was thrown away, rejected as heretical, and allowed to be forgotten. But history has a curious skill of exposing secrets. And finding this long-lost gospel in Egypt was just the start. One of the most surreal and mysterious moments in all of early Christian writings is the talking cross and the enormous looming Jesus from the Gospel of Peter. These precisions contrast strongly with the biblical Gospels that they prompt an unsettling question. Were these descriptions a metaphor, or did they reveal a forbidden theological orthodoxy that was blotted out of Christian history? In this lost Gospel's telling of the resurrection, something miraculous occurs. Two angelic figures, with heads that reach to the sky, descend from heaven and enter Jesus' sepulchre. Shortly thereafter, they return, bearing Jesus, not like an everyday Joe, but like a giant whose head touches the clouds. And trailing after them is something odder still, a talking cross. A voice from above inquires, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" To which the cross itself replies, "Yes." This is not a moment you find in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. In the four canonical Gospels, Jesus rises from the dead quietly, first appearing to Mary Magdalene and then to his disciples. But here, his resurrection is a cosmic event, witnessed by supernatural beings and involving an otherworldly, talking object. So what does this mean? Certain scholars theorize the imagery exists as a compendium of symbolism. The cross itself, outside of those first coins, appears less an instrument of death and more a living entity in early Christian texts, one which participates in salvation with Christ. The other option is that the cross speaks, which indicates that the message of Christ continues and is active even after his passing. That exchange between the cross and God serves as poetic device that ultimately communicates the same message: that Jesus had completed his sacrifice and fulfilled his mission even to preach to the dead. But others say this was more than poetic symbolism. Mystical and esoteric beliefs. In early Christianity, some groups, now considered heretical, thought mystical and esoteric ideas. The idea of Jesus' cross having its own divine essence would have resonated with certain Gnostic traditions, where objects and symbols contained hidden spiritual power. As Dan Oldfield puts it, if this text were to take hold of it, could shape a radically different vision of the crucifixion, one in which the cross itself is not simply a means of affliction, but a kind of divine actor, an entity that participates in Jesus' resurrection. And then there's the statue of the giant Jesus. What speculates him depicted as growing to gigantic proportions as he comes out of the tomb. In some ancient religious backgrounds, creatures that were considered deities were often depicted as giant to show their glory and might. With all of this, one can easily speculate that the physical size of Jesus grew in his mortal reflection to the divine figure of his heavenly reign. In this reading, his resurrection doesn't merely involve coming back to life, but rising to a cosmic status beyond what humans can achieve. But that also raises the other question: was this an early form of a heretical belief, one the church subsequently eliminated? Some church fathers say that this reflected a Christology rejected by authentic Christianity. The Jesus of the biblical Gospels is both human and divine, human in suffering and resurrecting, both divine and recognizable. But the account in the Gospel of Peter seems to present a Jesus who is above suffering, above bodily limitations, and whose resurrection is not a subtle personal event, but rather a giant cosmic event. This is much closer to certain Gnostic ideas, where Jesus was actually a purely divine being whose humanity was only apparent. If so, then this gospel's portrayal of Jesus represented a direct threat to what the church taught. The early church made determining the humanity of Jesus just as crucial a question as establishing his divinity. If he had felt like a normal man, then his sacrifice meant something. If he had come back from the dead in a human body, then he was still reachable to believers. A Jesus who ascended to the heavens and emerged from the tomb as a towering God blurred those boundaries. It implied another possibility, possibly that Jesus was never trapped by the limits of humanity at all. This makes the rejection of the Gospel of Peter more understandable. The emerging Christian story did not lend itself to a Jesus who was all divine, all distant from suffering, and all caught up in mystical stuff. A talking cross, while intriguing, might have been considered too strange, too mystical, or too susceptible to misinterpretation. The shape of early church was in the process of forming a faith rooted in both history and spiritual belief, and stories like these risked pushing Christianity along a more mythical and symbolic path, one that had the potential to draw people away from the message which the church was trying to create. But the very existence of this gospel suggests that early Christianity was anything but monolithic. Various groups had varying beliefs about who Jesus was, how he rose again, and the true meaning of his crucifixion. The Gospel of Peter may have belonged to a stream of belief that depicted Jesus as something more cosmic, more supernatural, and perhaps less human than the version accepted into the church. Once the church attained this power, it was up to the church which texts were sacrata and which were heretical. And this gospel, with its radical imagery, didn't make the cut. Yet, its discovery makes us reconsider the past. Was early Christianity more varied than we've been taught to think? Did certain groups have access to a version of Jesus that was intentionally suppressed? And would Christianity look very different today if the Gospel of Peter had been included in the Bible? While these questions remain unknown, there is one certainty, and that is that the lost Gospel of Peter will continue to challenge everything we thought we knew about Jesus. This Jesus presented in the Gospel of Peter bears little resemblance to the Jesus of the New Testament. Instead of showing him as an anguished human being, it represents him as entirely divine. So divine, he appears impervious to pain or weakness. This essential difference in theology could explain why the earliest church rejected this text as heretical. But why was this perspective considered dangerous? And what did that mean for early Christian belief? The approach that this gospel takes to Jesus' suffering is one of the most debated components of this gospel. In the canonical gospels, Jesus suffers intense pain. He is beaten, mocked, crucified, cries out in agony. His suffering is central to Christian theology, as it symbolizes the ultimate sacrifice for humanity's sins. But in the Gospel of Peter, Jesus is almost disconnected from his suffering. His death isn't one of anguish, but of a peaceful, almost effortless leaving of his body. This reflects a belief called Docetism, a widespread theological position that the early church vehemently condemned. Docetism, from the Greek word dokein, to seem or to appear, was the belief that Jesus only seemed human, but was in fact wholly divine. From this perspective, his physical suffering was illusory, and he never actually experienced the pain felt by ordinary human beings. This idea was one of the major controversies in early Christianity because it punched one of the foundational teachings of the faith, of Jesus being fully divine and fully human. The church asserted that the humanity of Jesus mattered as much as his divinity, because without real suffering, there could be no real sacrifice for sin. In fact, the Gospel of Peter appears to embrace this docetic view rather unabashedly. One of the more startling moments comes during the flashing button scene when Jesus is nailed to the cross and refuses to speak or even flinch. Unlike in the accounts of the New Testament, neither a cry of pain, nor his last words, nor his despair at the moment of death is mentioned. Rather, the Gospel of Peter portrays Jesus as if he were in complete control, as if what he is going through is nothing. It makes him seem more like a god watching events unfold than a man experiencing actual suffering. The Church's rejection of this gospel was therefore not only a theological one, but also one of authority. During the early centuries of the Christian era, various groups believed the identity of Jesus was something different from what we think today. Some regarded him as a divine-infused spirit. Others laid more stress on his humanity. To make its mark, the Church needed a common doctrine, which meant determining which texts were compatible with its teachings, and which had to be repressed. A gospel that presented an all-divine Jesus, one who could not suffer in reality, undermined the message upon which the Church was laying its foundations. So another aspect of the danger of this gospel was in its implications on salvation. Christian dogma holds that it was necessary for Jesus to suffer and die in order to atone for humanity's sins. If Jesus never really suffered, maybe, so what did his death accomplish? The notion that Jesus merely appeared to be crucified did troubling violence to the heart of Christian faith. If his suffering wasn't real, then was his sacrifice? And if his sacrifice was not real, what did that mean for salvation? These were questions that the Church could not let circulate among the faithful. Besides theology, however, there was the question of how this gospel may have shaped early Christians' perceptions of Jesus. A Jesus who was too God and too far away from human pain threatened to make him seem remote. In fact, one of the reasons Christianity was so effective in spreading was that it provided a God who walked among people, experienced their struggles, and suffered along with them. The version of Jesus, who was untouchable and immune to suffering, could have made Christianity seem more like a mystery religion, where divine beings interacted with the world in abstracted, supernatural, and landless ways, rather on the physical realities of the body. You are focused only on the Gospel of Peter when there needs to be more consideration to the wider history behind it. The 47 books of the New Testament, or what we call the Christian scriptures today, were written during the first few centuries of Christianity, when competing religious movements reigned in the Roman Empire, with the Church defining against Jewish traditions on the one hand and diverse pagan beliefs on the other. A gospel that strayed so far from the commonly accepted narrative would have risked fracturing the Christian community. Anti-heresy was sometimes a necessary step towards creating a large booklet. By rejecting texts such as the Gospel of Peter, the Church could create a more uniform doctrine that strengthened its authority and helped it endure against competing ideologies. In the end, the Gospel of Peter represented a form of Christianity inconsistent with developing orthodoxy, that it proposed a Jesus who was too divine and too far removed from suffering, and who was somehow too removed from the human experience. For a faith that was founded on the concept of redemption through sacrifice, it was a direct contradiction. The Church stated that this gospel was rejected not just for theological issues, but to ensure that the Jesus whom followers were following was one who could suffer, die, and rise in a way in which he could bring about salvation. But this begs an even deeper question. What would have happened if the Gospel of Peter had made it into the Bible? Would Christianity now be based on a radically different conception of Jesus? A much less earthy and suffering one, and much more of a God? Would the whole idea of atonement and redemption have been shaped differently? They are unanswerable questions, but one thing is clear. The Gospel of Peter was too dangerous for inclusion in the Bible. The erased part. It contradicts the narrative that the church had carefully woven, and it was erased for that reason. The Gospel of Peter offers a much different view of Pontius Pilate than that found in the canonical Gospels. Rather than portraying him as a culpable but reluctant accomplice in Jesus' execution, this Gospel all but exonerates him. In fact, Pilate is painted as what we would call an order taker who washes his hands of Jesus' fate. This shift in narrative begs the question, was there a political agenda behind this portrayal? It's possible this gospel was influenced by an agenda to make relations between early Christians and the Roman Empire better. To appreciate this, we must examine the way the canonical Gospels portray Pilate. In the New Testament, Pilate is depicted as a Roman governor who, despite his initial hesitance, ultimately succumbs to pressure from Jewish leaders and decides to execute Jesus. He literally washes his hands in front of a crowd, a representation of his effort to wash himself of any responsibility. Yet he does authorize the crucifixion, rendering him one of the central figures in the death of Jesus. The Gospel of Peter, in contrast, shifts almost all the responsibility off of Pilate's shoulders. Instead, it blames the Jewish authorities, claiming they are responsible for the execution of Jesus. This distinction is not merely a matter of detail, it has radical implications. That he portrays Pilate as innocent represents a clear political stance taken by the Gospel of Peter. Relations between Christians and the Roman Empire were complex during the first years of Christianity. The Roman authorities initially regarded Christianity as a troublesome offshoot of Judaism, and Christians were frequently persecuted. If such a gospel could have exonerated the Romans of responsibility, it may have served to heal seriously strained relationships between Rome and the nascent Christian movements, and align Christianity in a less unfavorable light before the empire. One possibility is that the Gospel of Peter's writers were part of a Christian community that sought to distance itself from Jewish factions that were at odds with Rome. Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries met with savage reprisals. Christians, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire, may have found it in their interest to stress their break from Jewish identity and to make Rome seem less of an enemy. A gospel that absolved Rome of guilt for Jesus' crucifixion might have done the trick. Moreover, this narrative might have served as an apology seeking to integrate with Roman authorities and obtain recognition. At this point, Christianity had not become a dominant force. It was a small and often persecuted movement. If Christians could somehow frame their faith as harmless to Roman rule, perhaps they could achieve greater survival. The Gospel of Peter thus would have been effective in an effort to completely shift the blame onto the Jewish leadership and change the politics of Christians in the empire. That leads us to another important question. Was the Gospel of Peter suppressed because it was too pro-Roman? The early church had a complicated relationship with political authority. Although it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, in its early days, Christianity was a marginalized, often persecuted movement. The canonical Gospels found a delicate balance. They recognized Roman complicity in Jesus' death, but at the same time placed substantial blame on Jewish leaders. It also enabled Christians to differentiate themselves from Judaism and not fully condemn Rome. But the way the Gospel of Peter portrayed Pilate seems to have gone too far, creating a political problem. Another consideration is how this timeline impacted perceptions of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. If Pilate were innocent, then why did he execute Jesus? According to the Gospel of Peter, purely the actions of the Jewish leaders led to his death, reinforcing an anti-Jewish sentiment that regrettably affected Christian thought for hundreds of years. This depiction may have appealed to factions that sought to create a stark chasm between Christianity and Judaism, but it also rendered the gospel controversial. This gospel may thus be a witness to an earlier different tradition about the trial of Jesus that was effaced with time by the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John versions. In the multitude of communities that made up early Christianity, there were many different perspectives on who was responsible for the death of Jesus. Some might have actually thought Pilate was a bystander rather than a participant. Yet as Christianity developed, both what became the Orthodox version that blamed Pilate, while still placing focus on Jewish involvement, became the principal narrative. The definitive exemption of Pilate in the Gospel of Peter might simply have been too radical or too politically driven to be included in the canon. The Church, while it wanted a monolithic theory, couldn't be seen to sanction a theory too close to Roman terms or politics, nor one that looked engaged in the rewriting of history for political expediency. The theological context, edit, sur edit source. In the late 2nd century, Bishop Serapion of Antioch found himself at the center of a theological storm. Given this position as the head of the early Christian church, it was his duty to make sure that believers were being guided properly so that the teachings they followed were in accordance with the emerging Orthodox faith. He was not dismissing the Gospel of Peter when he first heard about it. Instead, he allowed some Christian communities to read it, believing there was nothing harmful in it. But as he dug deeper, he found things that disturbed him greatly. What initially appeared to be a straightforward account of the life of Jesus came to be much more controversial, something he felt could lead the faithful astray. Serapion's first acceptance of the text was a matter of trust. The church at Rosses, the Gospel of Peter at this time, was used among Christian communities in Syria. As many believers viewed it as a holy text, he saw no reason to prohibit its use. But as reports began to emerge about its contents, anxiety increased. When Serapion actually read the Gospel himself, what he found troubled him. This account of Jesus' crucifixion differed quite significantly from the narratives included in the canonical Gospels. Among the most controversial aspects of the Gospel of Peter was its transcendence of Jesus as Jorgen only, with no real human images. This part of the text implied that Jesus had only appeared to feel pain on the cross, an idea that was so closely associated with Docetism. To explain away this gruesome aspect of his crucifixion, Ireneu tried to argue that Jesus, as a divine being, couldn't have suffered like an average human being. By contrast, Orthodox Christian teaching asserted that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, which meant at some level he was required to experience genuine pain and death for the sake of mankind's redemption. The Gospel of Peter was dangerous to Serapion precisely because it denied the Christian basis of redemption. The rejection of the Gospel of Peter by Serapion did not take place in a vacuum. Church leaders were in a larger struggle to define the boundaries of Christian doctrine during this period. We wrote about what Jesus did, but there was no form of the New Testament. Lots of writings being tossed around, but one, even 2 or 3 different takes on Jesus' message. Indeed, the church was still in the process of deciding which texts belonged in the official canon and which got thrown out as heretical. The Gospel of Peter, with its theological claims, did not gel with the framework that church authorities were constructing. Serapion's influence mounted, and the condemnation of the gospel became official. He proclaimed it heretical and warned Christian communities not to read or distribute it. This campaign was part of a larger effort by leaders of the church to consolidate its teachings. It wasn't just about their differences in terms of theology regarding the resurrection either. It was also about power and keeping uniformity in Christian doctrine. Text that strayed too far from the developing orthodoxy was deemed dangerous and swept from circulation. This was by no means the only text to enjoy such fate over the years. Writings from the early Christians, too, found themselves destined to be suppressed. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contained mystical sayings of Jesus that emphasized inner rather than church enlightenment. The Gospel of Judas offered an account of events in which Judas was not the betrayer, but a key figure in the unfolding of Jesus' divine plan. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene implied that Mary possessed a special spiritual insight that surpassed that of some male disciples. Similar to the Gospel of Peter, these writings posed a challenge to official discourse and were later branded heretical. By declaring such writings dangerous, the Church was able to centralize its power. They lived during a time of changing of different Christian faiths to a more consistent belief. The decision to include or exclude certain texts determined the future of Christianity in two senses, establishing which texts believers would accept as truth and which would be forgotten. Despite their condemnation, the Gospel of Peter and other so-called heretical writings were not completely eliminated. Half-dead fragments survived, tucked away for centuries, awaiting rediscovery and re-examination by later eyes. For centuries, through the shadows of history, the Gospel of Peter quietly slumbered, its existence almost forgotten. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which were carefully preserved and copied by the early Church, this text was consciously rejected. But what would cause a religious text that once was read by Christian communities to disappear almost completely? The answer can be found in a series of church councils, theological repression, and a concentrated effort to determine which texts would define Christian belief. The first centuries of Christianity were filled with fierce debates over doctrine. There were different Christian communities with differing beliefs, often drawing on differing writings to support their viewpoints. The Gospel of Peter was considered by some groups a valuable and powerful spiritual text, but by others, a pernicious distortion of the truth. The church leaders were trying to unify what it meant to have faith, so needed to remove any text that contradicted or challenged them. The Gospel of Peter, with its imagery of a sufferingless Jesus and its docetic tendencies, was among those declared heretical. It was church councils that instrumentalized this suppression. By the 4th century, Christianity had acquired immense political power, particularly following Emperor Constantine's conversion and the subsequent establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was during the councils, like the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and later the councils of Carthage and Hippo, when the official canon was developed, providing the accepted books of the Old and New Testament. Those texts that met the Church's emerging doctrines were preserved, while those that veered too far from the approved path were condemned. The Gospel of Peter, connected to a theological view that grew less and less accepted and was ultimately branded heretical, was out. Once a text was pronounced heretical, it had no chance of survival. Church authorities sought actively to destroy copies, discouraging their use and warning the faithful that such reading was not allowed. Thus, manuscripts were either burned or left to rot over time. In some instances, a collection of non-canonical writings could be lost to the world entirely by order of church officials, or because of changing political climates that had seen these once guarded documents left abandoned. Despite these measures, history has proven that erasing a text completely is very difficult. Periodically, bits of lost prose emerge. The Gospel, according to Peter, for instance, was found again in 1886 to 87, when archaeologists found some of it in a tomb in Akhmim, Egypt. This led to the question, might there still be more copies buried in neglected libraries, locked away in monastic estates, or lying in wait in ancient ruins? The rediscovery of other lost Gospels in the last century, like those found in the Nag Hammadi, seems to imply that other lost texts have gone unaccounted. These findings have renewed interest in early Christian texts that were once considered too controversial for entry into the Bible. Suppose a complete Gospel of Peter were to provide insight into the wisdom of early Christians and the theological struggles within the faith. Although it may have been erased from mainstream Christian tradition, the story of the Gospel of Peter is far from over. Its rediscovery has made scholars and believers reevaluate not only what was lost, but why some voices were silenced in the making of Christianity. The disappearance of the Gospel of Peter was not just the action of the early church. It may have had other powerful opponents. And although church authorities were instrumental in suppressing texts that were at variance with their developing doctrines, the political authorities, especially the Romans, would likely have viewed it as a threat as well. The question must then be asked, why did both religious and political powers of the day want this gospel to go away? Initially, it appears that only the church might have wanted the Gospel of Peter gone. After all, it offered a version of Jesus' death and resurrection that differed from the canonical Gospels. Its vision of Jesus as one who avoided human suffering and its strange picture of a walking, talking cross jolted the theological foundations that church leaders were adopting. And these differences posed problems for those bishops trying to unify Christian doctrine. But beyond religious worries, there were politically subversive consequences that made this writing threatening to the authorities. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the Gospel of Peter is its portrayal of Pontius Pilate. Whereas the canonical Gospels imply that Pilate was instrumental to Jesus' death, the Gospel of Peter exonerates him. Instead, it blames Jewish authorities and depicts them as the entity that instigated Jesus' execution. This story would have resonated with Roman officials who wished to distance themselves from complicity in Jesus' death. But it also raised concerns. If Pilate was innocent, why did Rome even grant Pilate the ability to execute this man? Might such a story be deployed to criticize Roman rule, or to reveal deeper currents of political struggles in the empire? Furthermore, aspects of the theology present in the Gospel of Peter may have posed a challenge to religious as well as imperial authority. Most of all, the Roman Empire was invested in co-opting volatile religious movements, especially when Christianity started to spread. The docetic tendencies of the Gospel, which implied that Jesus never actually suffered or died as a human, may have been seen as destabilizing. If Jesus had not suffered in reality, then wasn't that the end of the whole Christian story of sacrifice and redemption? And were different Christian groups to pursue such concepts, would that result in divisions that made it difficult for the empire to exert control over the religion? By the 4th century, through the rise of Christianity as an official religion under Emperor Constantine, the need for theological unity had only become more pronounced. The Roman authorities and the Church collaborated more closely to ensure that only certain texts secured validity. Even things that might threaten to split the faith, or those that opposed the newly established orthodoxy, in the eyes of the authorities, were dangerous. This implied that bishops and church councils were not the only ones to have an interest in getting the Gospel of Peter out of the way. Roman political leaders also had an interest in killing it. Power structures depend on control, and a text that offered alternate narratives, diverse theological interpretations, or opposing historical accounts represented a threat. Via church decrees, imperial power, or local repression, the Gospel of Peter was systematically scrubbed out of mainstream Christian tradition. But like other lost texts, it was never fully removed. Its rediscovery challenges the idea that history is written by a solitary authority and poses questions about what other voices may have been suppressed along the way. Had the Gospel of Peter been accepted in the Bible, Christianity could have turned in a significantly different direction, a radically distinct theological foundation. This lost writing shares a version of Jesus' resurrection and crucifixion that radically departs from what you find in the canonical Gospels. If this alternate narrative had been integrated into the body of Christian scripture, fundamental doctrines concerning suffering, salvation, and the divinity of Jesus may very well have developed in utterly divergent directions, and the implications for private belief and Christianity as a whole would look nothing like what we have now. One of the most notable features of the Gospel of Peter is its depiction of Jesus' suffering, or rather, the absence of it. Unlike the canonical Gospels that recount the physical pain and suffering of Jesus on the cross, this text implies that Jesus did not suffer in a human way. This viewpoint reflects a theological belief called Docetism, which states that Jesus was wholly divine but only seemed to possess a human body. Had it gained widespread acceptance, this interpretation would have revolutionized the way Christians understood the crucifixion. The crucifixion became no longer a moment of extreme pain and suffering, physical and emotional. It was all an illusion, they claimed, and the words on the cross were symbolic, not of an actual execution. This redefined understanding, in turn, would have had significant ramifications for salvation. Traditional Christian theology holds that the states of suffering and death of Jesus were an ultimate sacrifice for humanity's sins, an action which gave believers redemption and reconciliation with God. If Jesus never really suffered, then what does that mean for the atonement? Or would they have had some wholly different concept of redemption? Maybe instead of center of gravity being on sin, repenting, and forgiveness, Christianity would have focused on divine enlightenment, spiritual transcendence, or even a deeper mystical cognition of God. The Gospel of Peter contains an even more radical, if not simply a radical, resurrection account. It portrays a Jesus who seems larger than life, literally expanding to supernatural proportions as he steps from the tomb. In addition, there's a peculiar, even extraordinary element to the text, even a talking cross. This imagery is a stark contrast to the more astringent resurrection narratives in the New Testament, which present a genteel Jesus visiting his disciples in normal-seeming fashion. Had the Gospel of Peter version been accepted, Christian theology would have likely been even more symbolic and mystical than it became, instead of concentrating on the historical and literal. Rather than understanding resurrection as the corporeal return from death, however, believers may have viewed it as a cosmic event, a moment of divine revelation rather than of restoration of the body. This would help to explain why this topic, an afterlife that was not the resurrection of the body, influenced the way Christians would have seen what was in store after death. In addition to its theological implications, the Gospel of Peter gives us an alternate vision of the political arrangements surrounding Jesus' trial and execution. In this narrative, Pontius Pilate is exonerated for Jesus' execution, so the responsibility lies solely with Jewish leaders. This portrayal sharply contrasts with the canonical Gospels, which, while recognizing the Jewish leaders' role, also explicitly state that it was Pilate, as the Roman governor, who gave the order for the crucifixion. Actually, had the Gospel of Peter been included in the Bible, this change of narratives could have had serious historical consequences. Christianity's interactions with Rome could have ended differently, resulting in less ostracization of early Christians across the stretch of the Roman Empire. Simultaneously, though, this representation may have further incited brutal anti-Jewish attitudes in Christian spaces, influencing mindsets and skirmishes for centuries to follow. The acceptance of this gospel might also have produced different sectarian developments in early Christianity. Had the tone of the text emphasizing the divine nature of Jesus been widely accepted, perhaps Gnosticism, an early Christian sect emphasizing esoteric knowledge and spiritual transcendence, would not have been condemned as a heresy. Christian ministering, praying, and theological controversies would have taken a different course, perhaps leading to a variant of Christianity that was starkly different from the formal, doctrine-oriented religion that materialized under the providence of the Church. Perhaps worship practices emphasized mystical experience to a greater extent than the orderly sacraments and creeds that dominate mainstream Christianity. The Gospel of Peter, if we had it, would have had an influence not just on theology but on Christian art, Christian literature, even philosophy in ways we can only surmise. Would there never have been an image of Jesus more than a mile high, as he is shown in the iconography exploited by St. Thomas of Aquino and Giedelmanis 1517? Would the misguided fetish of a speaking cross ever arise? If there hadn't been so much emphasis on suffering and sorrow, would Christianity have evolved more towards celebrating divine victory than divine suffering? How did churches depict Jesus differently in their teachings and architecture? Speculative as the answers to these questions may be, the impact of such changes on Christian identity and tradition would have been profound. And it turns out, the Gospel of Peter was conveniently frozen out of the biblical canon. The New Testament developed differently, and that was the version of Christianity that would end up dominating. In pushing back against its alternative vision of Jesus, the Church cemented doctrines that emphasized both his divinity and humanity, as well as the need for his own suffering to achieve the salvation of humankind. However, the extraordinary existence of this lost gospel demands a deeper reflection. What rivers of voices, perspectives, interpretations were moss-covered over time? And if even one of them had survived, how different would Christianity, and maybe even the world, be today? It was in the late 19th century when the other Gospel of Peter, widely considered a lost scripture, was rediscovered, and with it, renewed academic arguments ignited about early Christianity, lost works, and the story of Jesus itself. Although the text had long been declared heretical and vanished from mainstream Christian tradition, its modern rediscovery has prompted historians and theologians to reassess its significance. Is this gospel a forgotten truth that comes with a cost to our understanding of Jesus? Or is it simply an old-timey myth that represents the variety of early Christian views? When the Gospel of Peter fragment was discovered in 1886–87 in the Akhmim graveyard of Egypt, many scholars were intrigued and slightly unsettled by its contents. This old manuscript offered a very different view of Jesus' death and resurrection than the one in the New Testament. Since then, scholars have scrutinized the text, tracing its relations with canonical Gospels and other apocryphal writings. Linguistic analysis has suggested that the Gospel of Peter dates to the 2nd century, when Christianity was still a developing faith tradition and various sects were vying for the legitimacy of doctrine. Some scholars have written that the text reflects an earlier, more original tradition, while others maintain that it was written later as a response to theological disagreements in the early church. One fascinating feature of the Gospel of Peter is its peculiar presentation of the suffering of Jesus, or even the absence of suffering. Such suggested in nearness, simplified docetic theology that Jesus remained all divine and did not feel pain ever humanly. The early church unanimously rejected this concept by highlighting the two natures of Christ, being fully divine and fully human. But that doomsday scenario is being challenged today by some researchers who question whether the perspective was unfairly marginalized. If there were early Christians who believed in different versions of Jesus' nature, why was one kept and the others erased? This very question calls us to reevaluate how different historical power struggles influenced what came to be considered official Christian doctrine. Apart from the theological motivation, the Gospel of Peter raises questions about historical accuracy. The text describes Pontius Pilate in a far more favorable light, removing him from any responsibility for Jesus' death and fully placing the blame on Jewish leaders. This contradicts the more complex portrayal in the New Testament, where Pilate is reluctant but ultimately accedes to the execution. Some scholars think that this version of events was driven, at least in part, by political motivation, an effort by some Christian groups to cozy up to Roman power. If so, then the Gospel of Peter reminds us that early Christian texts were not written in a vacuum, that social and political forces shaped their writing. Also fascinated modern scholars about the Gospel's resurrection account are its supernaturally rich components. Jesus emerging from the tomb like a giant and talking to the cross is nothing found in the canonical Gospels. Some scholars read these details as symbolic, expressing divine victory over death in an epic, near-mythological style. Some say it is a remnant of a lost tradition that saw Jesus in a more cosmic or mystical way. If things had gone differently in history, could this kind of resurrection have been widely accepted? And if it did, how might it have altered Christian ideas about the afterlife? The Gospel of Peter today is thus the subject of heated debate. Some religious scholars reject it as a later embellished tale that has little historical significance. Others, however, believe that it provides insight into the diversity of early Christian thought, evidence that Christianity was not always so unified as the later traditions would have us believe. Some theologians even suggest that revisiting these lost texts can inform contemporary faith, giving believers access to alternate views of Jesus' life and mission. The rediscovery of the text has also driven conversations outside of academic spaces. At a time when the history of religion is constantly being reimagined, some see the Gospel of Peter as part of a wider trend to unearth what they believe was knowledge that was repressed. Was this gospel intentionally deleted because it had potential to undermine church authority, or was it just one of many alternative accounts that never really took off? Such initial questions within the church typically resonate with an alternative culture that challenges religion and yet hungers for spirituality beyond conventional church walls. The Gospel of Peter, though not without its controversy, remains an object of fascination for historians, theologians, and those searching for hidden truths. Whether as a lost piece of Christian history or simply an ancient theological experiment, its rediscovery makes us ask difficult questions. How much of religious history has been molded by those who wielded power? How many other texts were written and lost or destroyed? And what other overlooked ways of seeing Jesus await exploration? The Gospel of Peter lay buried for centuries, both literally and figuratively. The rediscovery of the work in the 19th century raised disturbing questions about the nature of early Christianity, the configuration of religious doctrine, and the power structures that defined what was sacred and what was heretical. But what if this gospel was never lost? What if it always had been in the Bible? Would Christianity be totally different today? Or was it deleted specifically because it was showing a reality too dangerous for those in power? However, the Gospel of Peter presents a very different view from that found in the canonical Gospels. It makes Jesus divine in a way that denies human suffering, it casts Pilate as an innocent bystander, and it introduces supernatural elements that are in some ways pushing against the limits of traditional Christian storytelling. It doesn't just repeat the story of Jesus, it remakes it. This brings us to one of the hardest questions of all, which is this gospel a missing puzzle piece? Or is this an alternate reality invented by early Christian sects competing for the truth? After all, history is written by the victors, and religious history is no different. Through councils, by decree, and from theological wranglings, the Church determined which texts should be deemed divinely inspired and which should be relegated to the dangerous or false scrap heap. The Gospel of Peter was not just ignored, it was called dangerous. But why? Was it more because it contradicted the new orthodoxy, or because it showed something that could have changed the building blocks of Christianity itself? This piece dares its readers to reevaluate their knowledge of religious history. If one gospel could be excised and deemed heretical, how would the others fare? How many accounts of Jesus' life, teachings, and resurrection have been destroyed, erased by those who wish to control the narrative? How would the concept of salvation be different if the Gospel of Peter was included in the Bible? Would he have raised the doubts of Jesus being fully human and fully divine? The truth remains elusive. For some, the Gospel of Peter is little more than an ancient tale, a reminder of early Christian pluralism that carries little theological significance. For others, it is a glimpse into a version of Christianity that has been lost, one that was brutally repressed to create the faith as we know it today. Whatever the case, its existence confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. History is not always what it seems, and sometimes the most important truths are the ones that were never meant to be discovered. As we reflect on history and faith, a question remains. If something like the Gospel of Peter was buried from the world, what else lies buried beneath the sands of time?